In 1913, a Cambridge student named George Sewell goes home for the weekend. His family live in a spacious villa on a couple of acres of land in a leafy suburb, and he brings with him a handsome and extremely gracious aristocratic young poet named Cecil Valence, with whom he's having an affair. And the two young men have lots of fun flirting and frotting right under the noses of George's unsuspecting family. The aristocratic and rather randy Cecil makes a huge impression on George's young sister Daphne. In fact, he writes a longish poem about the weekend and the house in her autograph book. Then the war breaks out. Cecil is killed, and his poem, which is called 2 Acres, becomes a patriotic classic, a sort of paean to the homes and hearts of Middle England. Well, we know what went on that weekend because we have watched it happen. The rest of the book shows how, over the next few decades, these events and the character of the poet Cecil Valence are valorised, misinterpreted, lied about, and turned into a patriotic fiction. That's the setup for Alan Hollinghurst's new novel, The Stranger's Child. His previous novel, The Line of Beauty, won the Booker Prize. For Books and Arts Daily, would you welcome Alan Hollinghurst to the Adelaide Writers' Week?
I love this bit.
Alan, let's talk about the novel in just a minute, but perhaps we could get to know you first, to know your journey as a writer.
Okay.
The novel opens in the pastoral serenity of rural England, and I was wondering how much that England is like the Oxfordshire of your own childhood.
Not terribly. The novel actually opens in somewhere called Stanmore, which one or two of you may have heard of, which was a village to the north of London. And I think at the time when the novel opens is a place that you can, on the new Metropolitan Railway and so on, you could go and work in the City of London and get home to this place, which is still in London, but you've got fields at the end of the garden, you know. I grew up in a little country town in now in Oxfordshire, which is actually much more the setting of the middle part of this
Right,
book.
I see.
My father was a bank manager. He was a farming bank manager, so I suppose he loved going around farms, and he was a great expert on looking at cattle and stuff. So I spent a lot of my childhood on farms in the country.
And there was just the one of you?
Just me, fortunately, yeah.
And did that shape the writer that you were to become, do you think, that solitary childhood?
Well, I'm sure it did. A few years ago, somebody asked me to contribute to a volume of essays being written by writers who were only children, and asking them to sort of analyse what the effect of that had been on them. And I just realised I didn't want to do it. It was something that I felt was very important to me, but I didn't want to investigate it too closely somehow. It's like not wanting to go into analysis or something. You know, I think there is a sort of mystery to being an only child, and the way that you make your own unshared world when you're very young. I remember when I was about 6, my father saying to me, "I'm awfully sorry, old chap, but you're not going to have any brothers and sisters," and just feeling flooded with relief, because that was the last thing I wanted. And I think I did grow up very sort of self-reliant, probably. I then went away to boarding school when I was 7, in the brutal English way. So a lot of my sort of emotional life, I suppose, developed away from home. And I think being an only child was a good training for someone who takes as long to write novels as I seem to do.
What about the boarding
school? It requires a lot of solitude.
I mean, parents who see their children every night are bound to wonder what going to boarding school does to a boy. Most people in Australia, I reckon, would imagine that it would be a fairly unhealthy decision to make.
Well, I think that's the general view, isn't it? That you send young, impressionable people into an environment where they're, which is one in which they brutally learn to conform to various social norms, and leaving them fit only to run the empire or something. And a lot of people, of course, do have a terribly unhappy time. Perhaps it was, again, something to do with being an only child, but after a few tearful days, I decided I really liked my school. I was always very happy at boarding school through to the age of 17.
Well, according to legend, if you're a gay young man, it should be paradise.
Well, and there were a lot of them seemed to be gay young men for quite a while. Of course, then you realised you were rather keen on it than they were. It was just a phase, as we used to say.
Yes. Well, if they're all boys together,
Yeah.
then lots of boys will be on your side of the fence until they realise what's on the other side.
Exactly. No, there's a great deal to be said for it, I think.
I don't know why you're laughing. It just seems self-evident to me that that's how it would work. And what were you reading when you were young?
I think, well, all through my sort of teens, I read poetry a great deal, and particularly sort of romantic poetry, Victorian poetry, Keats, Wordsworth, Tennyson, writers who've remained sort of very much in my bloodstream, I think. I didn't go on to read sort of grown up. I suppose there were books you had to do for A-level, like I did Wuthering Heights and To the Lighthouse. In a way, you never know a book again as well as you know a book which you've studied for exams in your teens. But I think it wasn't really until I went to university that I started reading Dickens and George Eliot.
Isn't that extraordinary, though? The book you do in your A-levels or your Year 12 is a book you know intimately. I feel that way about Antony and Cleopatra.
Yes.
I just know it.
Yeah. Well, I think, To the Lighthouse sort of did get into my system in some deep way. In fact, I went back and read it just before starting to write The Stranger's Child because of its fascinating treatment of time. My book has these big gaps in its structure between the episodes, and Virginia Woolf, of course, does the thing of having 2 episodes with this amazing passage called Time Passes in between. No, I mean, it's almost impossible to trace the ramifications of the influence of books you read at that age, I think.
Were there books that you read at school and books you read for pleasure, or were they all of a piece?
I think they were all of. I mean, I had other crazes. But I had a mad Tolkien phase before that, which I couldn't bear to read anything but Tolkien. I used to write letters to my friends in dwarfish runes and things like that. And I was sort of completely obsessed with Tolkien.
You were that boy at your school.
Yes, did you have one of those?
Yes. He didn't win the Booker Prize, though.
And I was sort of forced to... I mean, they were rather worried about it at school, that I wouldn't read anything but Tolkien. I was made to read Trollope instead, which I'm afraid just poisoned Trollope for me for the rest. I've never been able to open a volume of Trollope since. Nor indeed have I been able to open a volume of Tolkien since about the age of 12. But
did you have a Rider Haggard phase?
Oh, God, yes.
Oh, good.
Yes. And I loved Rider, and I collected them, yes. No, they were... Were they absolutely terrible? They probably were.
No, they're not. No, not at all. King Solomon's Mines.
Yes.
There's a marvellous moment you'll remember when, for reasons that were never explained to me, our British heroes engage in a fight with Africans and they feel it necessary to remove their trousers.
Right, yeah.
Do you remember that bit?
Well, it must have made a deep sort of subconscious impression.
No, they fight without their trousers on. I never understood what that was about. Now, there are a few references to Tennyson in the novel. Was Tennyson...
Tennyson was a great love of mine from an early stage. The public school that I went to was called Canford, which is in a big Victorian country house in Dorset that had been rebuilt by a wealthy industrialist in the mid-19th century. And his wife was a woman called Lady Charlotte Guest, who translated the Welsh epic, the Mabinogion, that Arthurian epic. And she was a great friend of Tennyson. And she set up a little press at Canford where she printed the first edition of one of Tennyson's Idylls of the King, which you were allowed to hold if you were in the upper sixth. It was a sort of Victorian Gothic house in the country. It was a very Tennysonian sort of ambience. So I think Tennyson's sort of woven into my sense of my adolescence more than any other writer, probably.
Now, I've read you making reference to Lord Berners, is it, of Farringdon House?
Do you know about him?
No, not until you mentioned him in a piece I read by you.
Well, Lord Berners was a fascinating, very minor character. I mean, he was extremely rich, and he lived in the big house on the edge of the town where I spent the first 8 years of my life. He was quite a distinguished composer, and Stravinsky said he was the best English composer. I mean, nobody else thought so, but he wrote rather sort of sophisticated French-style music, unlike the kind of pastoral maunderings of most English composers of the time. And he wrote some sort of slightly surreal novels, and he painted a lot of not very good paintings. And he was a well-known eccentric. And at Farringdon House, he dyed all the pigeons in the different colours of the rainbow, which was an extraordinary thing to see as a child. I remember when I first came here and saw the galahs flying overhead, I sort of felt strangely at home. But he had a much younger boyfriend who inherited the house and kept up Lord Berners' traditions afterwards. So I think I did grow up with the sense of this strange, sort of gay, eccentric sort of on the periphery of my life, a rather fascinating figure. And I think it taught me something about the degree of acceptance of gay people, which is extended by a very conventional little market town if they happen to be rich. And there's a sense that it's just another eccentricity which is licensed by their wealth.
Yes, well, you were growing up at a time when the Sexual Offences Act was passed. I mean, it was passed in 1967. That's the act in Britain that legalises homosexuality. Did you feel accepted in the world that you moved in as gay?
Well, I mean, I was only 13 then, so it would have been a bit precocious of me. I dimly remember seeing, my parents' newspaper headlines at the time of the debate about that bill, and of course there was quite a strong faction in Parliament and in the House of Lords against passing the Sexual Offences Bill, and those who felt that homosexuality should remain a criminal offence. Obviously, it was a really sort of key event in our social history, I think. But I suppose nothing apart from the law changed overnight. But it ushered in a period in which it became possible to, well, obviously to live openly as a gay person without fear of prosecution. But also made it possible to talk about the lives of other gay people, and particularly what interested me and what comes out in this new book, to talk about the lives of gay writers in a way you hadn't been able to before. I mean, there was the interesting case of E.M. Forster, who died in 1970, and his gay novel, which actually he'd written during the First World War, Morris, but hadn't been able to publish in his lifetime. I mean, Forster didn't avail himself of that 3-year gap between the passing of the bill and his death to come out. But he came out sort of rather magnificently immediately afterwards, and Morris was published, and other gay short stories of his were published. So I think the time that I was a student through the 70s, I mean, I remember very strongly that atmosphere of things that hadn't been sayable before, and now being sayable and often being rather revelatory. I mean, now it's sort of fundamental to our sense of Forster as a writer to think of him as a gay man. Lionel Trilling, when he wrote his book about Forster, said he'd been completely unaware that Forster was gay. So there's been a huge change in understanding, I think, and that it was something which I suppose I played my little part in it at Oxford, where I did a graduate thesis about gay writers like Forster who hadn't been able to write openly about their sexuality.
It was called The Creative Uses of Homosexuality in the Novels of E.M. Forster, Ronald Furbank and L.P. Hartley. Did the thesis have a thesis?
I wonder if it did. I haven't really looked at it in the last 30 years. I think one of the things that it looked at, as far as I remember, was horribly well researched, aren't you? I usually just get away with this kind of thing. Was that restraints, although irksome to a writer, could also have quite an interesting, stimulating effect, and that Forster found himself writing rather starting with the basic sort of heterosexual presumption for a social comedy, which is going to end in marriages and so forth. I mean he took interestingly sort of subversive approaches to that. And indeed, in his last greatest novel, The Passage to India, he goes completely beyond it into a scenario where the two young people who are supposed to get married move irreparably apart, and the novel is really about the relationship between an English man and a Muslim Indian man,
and whether they can be friends.
Whether they can be friends,
but not about whether they can be lovers.
No, not about whether they can be lovers. But I think And I was probably I was probably exaggerating in my thesis, but that was perhaps also part of the atmosphere of the time, of sort of outing people and discovering this subject. I don't know. I'll have to go back and look, I guess.
You were reading English at Magdalen College, which is a very privileged place to be. And according to legend, if you're in that kind of environment, there is a kind of high church homosexuality that is licensed and has long been so. Is that actually the case?
I wish it had been. No, no. I mean, Magdalen was Oscar Wilde's college, but I don't think that had any sort of lasting effect on the. No, I didn't feel that particularly. I mean, there was a gay sock and things, but I mean, those were university things. No, I don't think that the atmosphere was actually surprisingly kind of austere, I think, at that time.
Is that right?
Yeah.
There's no colour in the stained glass windows in the chapel. Perhaps that tells you something. Let's look at the novels, or some of them. The Swimming Pool Library is very candid and confronting in the way it deals with sex. You depict gay sex, sometimes quite reckless, and don't spare the details. Did you write that with any sense that you're putting yourself at risk?
What sort of risk?
Well, that you were standing up in public and saying, I'm a gay man and I'm going to write about sex in a very explicit way and I'll take whatever criticism I get. Or did you feel that you could do that and your time had come, that there was an audience and a public that were ready to go?
Well, of course, I hope there will be an audience and a public. I was aware of it being something which hadn't quite been done in kind of British literary fiction. I think perhaps in the States it had a little bit. There was Edmund White's very important book, A Boy's Own Story, had come out a few years before. It was that historical moment we were talking about, of this big, slow change in what could be said. And I just felt I was terribly lucky that I had this amazingly interesting subject, the whole area of gay lives, both in the present and in the past, because the book sort of interweaves the story of a young man living in the early 80s with that of a man who was born in 1900, who's grown up under very different sort of social and legal constraints. There seem to be amazing stories to tell and sort of social worlds to investigate. So I think I did it with a sense of excitement and novelty. Of course, there were anxieties about it, and it was. I remember it was very difficult to sell the paperback rights before no one would touch it, and they thought, I'm not sure this is going to work.
But it turned out quite well, didn't it?
I just thought perhaps the book was just going to be a squalid sort of flop, But fortunately, people paid a lot of attention to it, and it was in the bestseller chart for months, and then there was a thrilling bidding war for the paperback rights. So I was so glad I hadn't, in fact, sold them before.
£100,000.
At least.
Oh, at least £100,000. So your life must have really turned a corner.
I think I suppose it did. I mean, I'm quite a shy person, really, and I think a lot of people are rather astonished by my having written this terribly frank book. Also, I was the deputy editor of the Times Literary Supplement at the moment, and perhaps there was something quite amusing too about this book having emerged from, as it were, the heart of the literary establishment. The paper, of course, was owned by Rupert Murdoch, who questioned the publisher of the Times supplements about, was it true that this filthy book had been written by one of his journos? I was told that it was, and he said, well, he supposed he couldn't fire someone for publishing filth, which I thought was a real...
I once supervised a doctoral thesis written by a student who arrived at our second meeting with a lever arch file full of blank pages, and it was divided into chapters, and he said, that's my thesis. I said, what do you mean that's your thesis? You've only been working on it for a month. He said, no, that's the thesis, and I'm going to fill every page in this folder, and when I get to the last page in the folder, my thesis will be written. And I thought, that's insane, but I gather you did much the same with that novel.
Well, it's quite true. I did, yes. I wrote the Swimming Pool Library in a desk diary which someone had given me, and I wrote page 1 on January the 1st, 1984, and I wrote page 2 on January the 2nd, and I thought, this is great, I'll do a page a day. By the end of the year, I'll have written a novel the 300, being a leap year, 366 pages. And they were, of course, about the end of January. I was only on January the 10th. And I think it took me about 3 years or more to get to December the 31st. But it was very useful for me feeling that I had this finite space that I was going to fill rather than just sort of setting off into some much sort of towards some much vaguer shape and destination. And the book, in fact, retains the form. It has 12 chapters, each of which ended on the last line of the last day of the month. And so it was a rather dotty thing to do, and I would never do it again, I think, but it was oddly reassuring.
It mightn't be a bad way, though, to get a first novel written if someone was starting out.
Well, yes.
It's a great discipline.
Yeah, it was a good discipline, actually.
And I'm talking to Alan Hollinghurst about his new book, which is The Stranger's Child, a less raunchy book, a calmer book than the others. They are defiant in some way about their gay subject matter. Now it's taken for granted. Is that a change in you?
Well, I think it's. I think how I write has changed, but so has the world into which I am writing. You know, the world into which the Swimming Pool Library emerged in 1988 is very different from 2011 when this book appeared. There's been an enormous shift, not only actual legal shifts, but social shifts in attitude. I think a great generational change in how gayness is viewed, understood. All that urgency and novelty I was describing has ceased to be the point of it. I mean, it was very much the point of that first book, but it simply isn't anymore. I mean, I remain very interested in gay stories, and there's a very sort of important to the book, thread of, as you know, of a gay story and its sort of suppression and eventual emergence over the course of the century in this book. But I think with my previous book, The Line of Beauty, there is a book which is all seen from the point of view of a young gay man, but he's moving through a much larger sort of social world. So I think I see myself now as certainly having that important element in books, but the whole book not being, and nobody, I think, when Line of Beauty won the Booker, it was described as, in headlines and things, as gay novel wins Booker. And so I don't think anybody has called this a gay novel.
No, it's not. It actually, well, it isn't. I mean, it's got a gay story in it, yeah. But it's a novel about life on a huge scale.
I think that's what has happened. That gay writing had its moment and its momentum and its sort of historical necessity, and as things have changed, it will just merge back into the mainstream, and people will write about gay lives and straight lives, without any sense of it being a distinct subject area.
Alan, it would be great to hear some.
Okay. It's hard to know what to read from this book, and hard to do it without giving a lot of the surprises, which the book depends on, away. But anyway, Michael's already told you that Cecil is going to get killed in the First World War. So, no, that's all right. I think spoiler alert. I'm just going to read just a paragraph from the second part of the book, set in 1926, when George, his lover, his younger lover in 1913, has gone to the Valence country home and is he's sort of kneeling beside his tomb in the family chapel, which has a recumbent marble monument of him in full uniform on it. And he's been sort of drawn back into remembering the beauty of Cecil at Cambridge and their love for each other. George dropped his head again, rather wondering about this probing of old feelings. It was awful that Cecil was dead. He'd been wonderful in many ways, and who knew what he might not have gone on to do for English poetry. Yet the plain truth was that months went past without his thinking of him. Had Cecil lived, he would have married, inherited, sired children incessantly. It would have been strange, in some middle-aged drawing room, to have stood on the hearthrug with Sir Cecil, in blank disavowal of their mad sodomitical past. Was it even a past? It was a few months. It was a moment. And then there might have been another moment in the study one night, which Cecil now occupied as surely as his father had done. Some instinctual surrender to the old passion, George bald and professorial, Cecil haggard and scarred. Could passion survive such changes? The scene was undeniably fantastic. Did he take off his glasses? Perhaps Cecil by then had glasses too, or a monocle that dropped between them just as their lips approached. Only young men kissed, and even then, not frequently.
Alan Hollinghurst reading from his novel The Stranger's Child here at Adelaide Writers' Week before a wonderful audience. In fact, there's a great crowd of people under the trees here and under the blue awnings. Can I hear your response again to that wonderful reading?
We must always talk together, I think, Michael.
Is that a proposition?
It certainly is.
Yes, I reckon you might have won the record for pulling the biggest crowd here at Writers' Week. You must be
very
coming
flattering.
Very, very close. Now, this is a book about lots of things. It's a book about memory in some ways and about the fallibility of memory. It's also a war book. Are there writers who helped you shape your view of what had happened in the First World War?
Yes, there are. I mean, it's the peculiarity of this book, and I knew it would be from the start, that although it is in a way a war book, it's a book in which the war itself is omitted. And in fact, in two of the gaps between the 5 sections of the book, in the first one, the First World War happens, and in the second one, the Second World War happens. What I wanted to trace, I suppose, was the impact of this great traumatic event on those who survived it. I knew that I didn't want to write a book which, spent months in the trenches and so forth. But nonetheless, I felt I did need to sort of get those under my belt, as it were. So I read and reread quite a lot around that period. Robert Graves's wonderful Goodbye to All That, some of Siegfried Sassoon's things. I reread a lot of sort of second-rate poetry that was written at the time, because it's rather a point about Cecil the poet in my book that, he's not top class, really. There are other writers who are sort of knocking around in the background of the book, I think, but who don't contribute so much to the
Well, there are
the
echoes
war,
of Rupert Brooke, of course. I mean, Cecil mirrors Rupert Brooke, but at one stage you were careful to tell us that Rupert Brooke is also hanging around, and clearly, well, I assume that was your writerly technique to say to us, this isn't supposed to be Rupert Brooke, this is some other
I think writers often do that, yes, when they put someone rather clearly modelled on a real person, they put the real person in as well, just as a show.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I took quite a lot from Brooke, because his story is such a fascinating one, I think, someone whose life was obviously hideously complicated by his own extraordinary sort of physical beauty.
The handsomest man in England.
Yeah, and great gifts. If I don't, I think he was actually not a very good writer, but obviously a person of extraordinary sort of intelligence and vitality. And the fascinating thing that happens to someone like that if they die very young. Brooke died. He didn't die in action, as I'm sure you know. He died from an infection from a mosquito bite on a troop ship. But nonetheless, after his death, Winston Churchill wrote about him in the Times. His most famous poem, perhaps The Soldier, became a sort of something that everybody knew by heart. And this very complicated, and in a way not very pleasant young man, was immediately turned into an icon of a gilded icon of this lost generation.
Gilded is actually the word that's used, isn't it? He's a gilded youth.
He's a gilded youth. He had a very powerful mother who commissioned a man called Edward Marsh to write a memoir of him, and this was another thing which I sort of lifted shamelessly for my book. and she controlled what was said I mean, she kept sending it back to Edward Marsh and getting him to take out more and more of the lifelike things in it, until when it was finally published, Virginia Woolf wrote a wonderful thing about it, saying how the image of Rupert Brooke in this memoir was utterly unrecognisable to anybody who'd actually known him.
She actually went skinny dipping with it, didn't she?
Well, yeah, I mean, she knew him better even
Than that.
So I think it was very fascinating then. You have all the people who have a vested interest in someone who dies at that age.
So what's that about? I mean, does that Rupert Brooke that you've just described have to be invented because if I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England, needs a man behind it who is admirable? Is that why we need to create this legend of the man who wrote those resonant words?
I think it probably is. It's probably something to do with the attitudes with which people went into that war, were those of earlier kinds of war. I mean, and they're things which aren't really registered in Brooke's own work at all. We go to Wilfred Owen for a sense of the true brutality of this new mechanised war. But the sort of war that Brooke's writing about, and that is one made out of very old-fashioned rhetoric, and I think people, and there's that wonderful book by Paul Fussell about the Great War and modern memory, when he shows that the whole language that was used about the war, particularly in its earlier years, was a sort of heroic, chivalric one, and something like that. I think, yes, exactly. A figure like Brooke immediately offers himself as a sort of icon of that.
Do you remember there's that moment in Fussell where he tells you that sunrise, which has been a symbol for hope in literature, is actually a symbol for fear in the First World War.
Yes.
And it's sunset that people view as a time of hope because that's when the killing stops.
Yeah,
it's a shocking thing, isn't it?
Well, he so brilliantly draws out so many ironies of that kind that the war inflicted on the way that people thought about almost everything, actually.
So there are ways in which your Cecil is like Rupert Brooke, because he's not that nice a chap. He's not a horrible chap, he's just a chap. I mean, to me, that's the point of him. He's just this chap who's precocious in the way we've all known precocious young men.
Yes,
and yet he gets turned into something else.
I mean, he comes from this sort of minor aristocratic background, so I think he perhaps has an even higher sense of entitlement and kind of joie de seigneur. And, he's someone who's used to having his own way sexually. I mean, I wanted to contrast the Cambridge world in which he and George meet. They're both members of this secret but famous society called the Apostles, and whose sort of principle was complete candour in the discussion of everything. And I think in that Cambridge world, and figures like Lytton Strachey, for instance, who went on to be a great kind of free speaker for the Bloomsbury group, there would have been a much greater degree of openness about. I mean, one thinks of the years after the Oscar Wilde trials as being one in which gay life was completely sort of closed down in England. If you read Lytton Strachey's letters, you see that this really wasn't the case at all within a certain milieu. So I wanted to contrast that world, which young George has found rather liberating, with the very different world of his sort of suburban home, which he brings Cecil into.
As an Australian, I found the first section of the book quite difficult to read because it is a world of utter privilege. And I kept thinking, why am I caring about these people? I mean, am I being told that their lives are tragic or intense or worth attending to simply because they're well born? Because even the people who live in what you call the suburban house do live in a place that's called 2 acres. It's a pretty substantial suburban house. It merely looks insignificant because Cecil comes from a huge, rambling, aristocratic pile.
Cecil has 3,000 acres.
Yes, and one has a manservant who sets out one's things in the morning and so on. And it's only later, you actually got to be quite patient as a reader, because it's only later that we discover that the book is interrogating the world of utter privilege that we've been dwelling in for that first third of the book.
Yes, well, I'm pleased you say that. I mean, I thought, in a way, the first two parts of the book, which is 1913 and then 1926, which is set in the Valance's country house, yes, they do take you back into a kind of earlier literary periods as well, I suppose, but earlier social periods, which are then, as you say, interrogated and indeed altered by the passage of time. I mean, this country house undergoes further vicissitudes. The lives of the people who live in it sort of disintegrate. The power of the aristocracy in the earlier parts of the book is really completely dissipated by the end of the book. the mother, the powerful mother, is determining early on how the story of her son is going to be told. But it's a kind of young working class man who ends up telling this story in the 1980s. So I think the book, yes, it does show. I mean, it shows all kinds of change, but that is certainly one of them.
Let's talk about that young working class man. So there's a man called Paul who comes along and decides he's going to tell the story of Cecil's life. He's going to write the literary biography. He's a man from a bank.
He's a man from the bank.
He's a man from a bank. That's your world.
That's right. The little town, as I was saying, where the middle part of the book is set, is very much based on Farringdon, and we lived over the bank for the first 8 years of my life. So, I mean, it is a wonderfully reassuring thing about writing novels, I think, finding that I have, and I'm sure all novelists, or all who write kind of realistic fiction, must feel this, that, oh yes, there's another whole area of my life I hadn't thought of for decades, but which I can now sort of plunge into. And I found that I had the whole world of the bank. So after everyone had gone home, I used to sort of play behind the tills, and I could just remember it all so vividly in the routines.
Hope you didn't make any
life.
Withdrawals.
I was utterly locked. I remember sort of all you got to do was sort of play with the paper clips and rubber stamps and things. But that was all there to me. And the second part of the book is this sort of hectic weekend party with everything spinning out of control. Young Daphne's marriage sort of breaking up, sort of drunkenness and madness. Then the third, the 1967 part of the book, just sort of plunges one into this sort of provincial torpor, really. And this is the world where young Paul Bryant has got a job as a cashier in this bank. And he's someone who's grown up without any of the sort of privileges, educational advantages and so on of the characters in the earlier parts of the novel. But he's someone, with strong literary interests. He reads a lot. He's gay, so he's trying to sort of find a way of living his own life and looking for encouraging signs in books that he's reading and so forth. But rather like George in the first part of the book, he needs a more self-confident sort of liberator to bring him out. And in the third part of the book, we see him sort of edging towards having an affair with a young man who's of his own age, I think, but vastly more experienced, who's a school teacher.
Yes, and it's difficult to tell what your view of him is, because he could be viewed as a kind of literary wannabe, who's been denied entry to the charmed gates of
young Paul,
Yes, young Paul Bryant, who's been denied entry to the charmed gates of Oxford or to Cambridge, but knows that world and wants to be part of it. And so kind of in his middlebrow way blunders into that world and isn't quite welcome.
That's right. I mean, I think right at the end you still see a sort of snobbish resistance on the part of further surviving outliers of the Vallance family to this young person who's come in and finally told all sorts of truths about Cecil. Perhaps exaggerated some of them. We never quite know how good his book is, but he has certainly fully availed himself of those freedoms we were talking about earlier to sort of say all the things that weren't sayable earlier on. He sees a great opportunity for himself in this. He was, I think, the most difficult character to write that I've ever done. He's someone who I think the reader will follow sympathetically early on, but as he grows older and sort of he turns into something else less sympathetic. At the end of the fourth section, which is really made up of him conducting his researches into Cecil's life and interviewing the various octogenarians who actually knew him, with all of whom he has a difficult time in one way or another. And the final sort of confrontation is between him and Daphne, whom we've been following since she was 16. And I hope the reader feels that they've been encouraged to have a sympathetic interest in both these characters, but now they come head to head, they're both actually behaving rather badly, and I hope the reader doesn't know whose side the sympathy is on.
All I told them was that he died in the First World War. You lectured in English in Oxford in the 1970s. In Australia, we no longer have English departments. The shrivelled remnants are found in departments of cultural studies or culture and communications. What happened?
In Australia?
Well, I mean, if we're... No, I'm not asking you to comment on Australian. Where do you think literature went? Literature was all powerful in the 70s in universities. Is it still powerful in universities, or has it moved out of the universities and given way to something else?
I'm probably not the right person to ask, actually, because I'm sort of so out of academic life now, but I'm very aware of all sorts of arts and humanities departments being closed down, and universities no longer having a classics department or a music department or a French department. I think English departments generally survive.
Well, in the 70s, you were in an English department, weren't you?
For 5 minutes, yeah.
Have you got... Were you actively involved in teaching, or were you teaching creative writing?
When I was a graduate student at Oxford, I did various bits of very, very humble tutoring. And I think in my early biographical notes I said, I taught at the University of Oxford, tried to create a rather grander impression than...
Well, it did. It created a grand impression. I'm disappointed now. You were there for 5 minutes.
And I taught for one term at University College London before jumping ship and becoming a journalist.
So you don't need to doctor your CV anymore. You've won the Booker Prize.
Exactly. You drop all that after a bit.
That's right. What's next?
Well, you won't get round my constitutional secretiveness about anything that I'm actually working on, even if I knew myself. I usually have a kind of 2-year turnaround period between finishing a book and starting the next one. So I'm making notes, and a book is kind of coming to me, but it hasn't really quite come yet. I probably won't start writing it till early next year, I guess.
You haven't bought the big diary yet.
I haven't got that diary yet.
Let's have some questions. There's a microphone there right in the middle of the aisle there. So if you'd like to...
Speaking as a gay man myself, I think your novels over the years have very much echoed different stages of gay life in the Western world. And with The Swimming Pool Library, which I remember reading with great eagerness when it first came out, it was the first novel that really, in a way, in the English language, I mean, taking aside some of the things that were very specific to New York that were happening at the time, but in the rest of the English-speaking world, a sense of legitimising what had been hitherto a hidden life. And I think that's what I found the most fascinating thing about The Stranger's Child. And as director of our state library here, which has endless manuscripts, many of them embargoed because so many things that families would not allow to be said. And every now and then we come across something that is revealed. What I found most fascinating, I think, in The Stranger's Child, at the end, we don't know the end. Did you quite deliberately withhold a nice, cosy tying up of all the loose ends at the end of that, and if so, why?
Yes, I did, and I think, if you compared it to The Swimming Pool Library, say, that is a book in which a young man reads the journals of an old man, and his doing so leads him to a revelation, which I'm not going to spoil for you, which leads him to reinterpret a great deal about his own family and his own past. I think I'd just become tired of that model, which is a very common one in fiction, where a book contains a secret which, when finally revealed, makes everything make sense. And it seems to me, life's not like that. And I wanted, by punching so many holes in this book, as it were, to get away from such a watertight sort of structure. I wanted to create uncertainty in the reader, and the reader shares the uncertainty and ignorance of a lot of the characters themselves about what actually happened between people they knew quite well in the past. I was aware of a different sort of literary detective novel that I might have written, and that I was quite attracted to writing, with a sort of paper chase of manuscripts and so forth. But actually, really, my subject was much more to do with not so much with remembering, but forgetting, and the way so much about the past, about our own lives, is sort of irrevocably lost to us. But I kind of play with the reader, I acknowledge, at the very end in that respect.
Alan, I've read all your 5 books and I really love the Swimming Pool Library, the first one, probably most of all. Something that seems to recur that I do find a bit troubling seems to be you're enamoured with the upper crust, and this is a very egalitarian society, Australia. We have real problems with that, and I certainly do in your novels. And I thought, God, in that last one, when Daphne, she's on her uppers, she's living in a Grace and Favour apartment, she's being sniffy to the poor bank teller. And I found this a bit disturbing, I must say.
Well, yeah, we don't buy this, Alan. We in the colonies. Explain yourself.
Well, I've always thought the upper crust were, quite good value to write about, and they have so much free time and so much more opportunity for sort of behaving badly in an amusing way. But I think I've always written about them in a fairly ambivalent way, and certainly in both the Line of Beauty and this book, you have a young character who's kind of glamorized by an upper class world and sort of sucked into it, and then in the case of the Line of Beauty, we enter this posh house with young Nick at the beginning of the book, and we're kind of expelled from it at the end of the book. And similarly, I think that Daphne is drawn into the often very kind of brutal social mechanisms of the upper class world, and she gets tangled up in the cogs, and she drops out of it, and then, as you say, in latter life, she's living in this state of pathetic sort of dependency in this hideous. We're really spoiling now. This hideous bungalow. So I hope it shows that those sort of class mechanisms are, in a way, rather sort of violent and horrible ones.
Hello. I just thought I'd ask you again the name of the thesis you wrote that started you off on the trajectory.
You'd have to ask my interlocutor for that. I can't remember what.
You're very well researched.
It was called...
It's called...
It's a really snappy title, I know that.
Yes, it's an absolute corker. The creative uses of homosexuality in the novels of E.M. Forster, Ronald Furbank and L.P. Hartley.
Thank you.
It doesn't jump off the page, does it?
In retrospect, I see why it was never successfully published, I guess.
I suppose one of the things the book does is call into question the very possibility of writing a history that has any kind of veracity at all. Are you as sceptical as that?
Well, I'm not really, no. I mean, I think the kind of history that the book's particularly concerned with, of course, is that of biography. I wanted to write about that situation, which I keep encountering because I'm often interested in rather minor writers. It's often the fate of minor writers to attract a rather cranky biographer who sees an opportunity there, writes an absolutely terrible book about them, and because they're such minor figures, they're not going to have their life written again for a long... I mean, the great Ronald Furbank, a writer whom I continue to champion, is a prime case of this. So I think we don't know quite about Paul's biography of Cecil Valence, but I wanted to suggest at least that he's sort of fallen into the hands of someone who really sees this as a career opportunity for himself as much as that. My feeling is that in the writing of biography, as in the writing of novels, there are great novels, there are great biographies, and there are terrible ones. And it depends, the writing of biography, not only on scholarship and research and so on, but on human wisdom and insight. And a biography which meant a great deal to me in the writing of this novel, The Stranger's Child, and actually sort of stands behind it in a lot of ways, is Michael Holroyd's great Life of Lytton Strachey, which came out with rather uncanny timing in the autumn of 1967, just after the change in the law. And this was the first book biography which did write openly, fully, unembarrassedly about the life of a gay writer. Very important book, and a marvellous, it remains a great... Michael Holroyd is a wonderful biographer, but we've all read biographies which don't live up to that high standard. I suppose I was having fun in this book with the idea of the fallibility of memory, which is something which I'm convinced of more and more. And if one is merely depending on memory to talk to a biographer about something which happened 30 years ago, either you're not going to remember it at all, or what you're going to remember is some long ago fossilized version of it. As Daphne says, she doesn't have memory, she has memories of memories. And so I think we all establish versions of things which happen, particularly if it's the case, did you know this famous poet? Yes, I did. Oh, do tell me about him. Then you will have a little routine that you do about him. And this becomes increasingly divorced from any live memory of the actual person and event. And that's bound to have implications for the writing of
Yes, once you
biography.
tell an embellished, or once you relate an embellished account of some event that you were involved in, it becomes the truth for you, doesn't it? You actually can't remember that you made it.
Well, you can't. And I think anecdote itself is such an unreliable sort of thing, because people tell a funny anecdote about something, and in the retelling it doesn't seem quite funny enough, so it's sort of enlarged and embroidered, and it has a sort of life of its own. And this is very much the case with Lord Berners, whom we were mentioning earlier, this eccentric who once travelled. He had his Rolls Royce adapted so that he could carry a clavichord, a little keyboard instrument, under the front seat when he was there. And this then became, and I've read accounts of people saying they remember seeing Lord Berners, who had a grand piano in the back of his car, which he used to play on as he was driven around the country. Much more entertaining, but actually not true.
Do you do any research yourself? Because you have such a wonderful ear for the literary cadences or the cadences of conversation of a particular period. In fact, one of the ways we as the reader register that you've undergone a time jump is that people are talking slightly differently. Do you do research to capture those shifts
Not exactly. I mean, I suppose I was very, from the third, fourth, or fifth parts of the book all take place during my own lifetime, so I had a much more direct sort of access to those matters then. The first two parts of the book were of necessity much more sort of literary fabrications, I suppose, and I was very struck by the fact that our whole sense of how people conducted themselves and spoke in 1913 comes above all from reading novels written in that period, and probably from seeing film adaptations of them and so forth. And there's something irreducibly literary about our sense of the past. And so I think, no, I didn't. I was very anxious not to write sort of pastiche, but perhaps just to absorb by exposure the verbal habits of earlier periods. And I wanted the language of each section to be sort of consistent with the period that it was. So my favourite reference tool, the Oxford English Dictionary online, which gives datings of the first usages of things, was a constant point of reference for me in writing this book.
When I was younger, I had an impression in Australia that our memories and our appreciation of the wars was sort of fading away. But I've seen in recent years a much more romantic impression of Gallipoli. And for young people, there's many Australians that like to go and remember these times. I guess my question is, do you think that as we're going into the teens of this new century, the way we think of the world wars continues to change?
It probably does. I mean, I feel I've seen it emerge as a subject. I mean, I think when I was a schoolboy was the time that people started being taught the war poets and so forth, and it became a subject. And then, it's like talking about Rupert, the truth about Rupert Brooke taking decades to emerge. That the adjustment towards that war was so slow, and there were stages like, I think Paul Fussell's book was one of them, when we started to see it in a new way. I feel that it's an immense preoccupation now with young. I think everybody is sort of terribly interested by it and moved by the First World War like no other war, really. I can't quite account for it. I mean, I did actually want the design of this book to be repeatedly marked by wars, and actually the Second World War leaves its traces on it as well. And in the original design of the book, which I sort of dispensed with in the end, I was going to have a character in the last part who's a soldier who's come back from the Gulf War. But I thought that was sort of making it was too sort of thematically heavy. But our lives are so continuingly marked by, we see on the television every day, the coffins coming home from Afghanistan and so forth. Those are things to which we have a different relationship, obviously, from the Great War. I'm not sure I know enough about it to answer your question. I just know that it still feels a very live subject to me.
Is the way in which you studied the war as a schoolboy by contrasting Rupert Brooke with Wilfred Owen, was that the classic manoeuvre?
I think that did come into it, yes. There were poems which were sort of splendid rhetorical kind of wish fulfillment in a way.
Of the war they thought they were going to fight, and then Wilfred Owen moved him into the sun gently, its touch awoke him once even in France. That poem Futility,
exactly,
the old vibe.
That counterpart to it, exactly. Yeah.
Would you please thank Alan Hollinghurst for being our guest here at the Writers' Festival.
Thank you very much, Michael.